for example, transatlantic migration before the First World War, you saw this. But migration also feeds a logic of economic agglomeration, the pulling of capital and labor to the rich countries, or within the rich countries to those areas that are undergoing enrichment. And then what sets in are the reinforcing logics of socioeconomic polarization, which push wages and profits up in the core relative to the periphery. And on top of that, migration represents, as I'm sure you're all aware, from either in theory or from knowledge of migrants, migration represents a colossal aid package from poorer countries to richer countries, because the new workers who arrive in Western Europe, in the United States, etc., they arrive without the costs attached. Their labor power has been reproduced by their mothers, by their grandmothers, by taxpayers through state institutions in the sending country, and they arrive with all those costs paid for. It's an enormous transfusion of aid to basically to the West and to the rich world. Related to this, migration can lead to a kind of demographic polarization. If you look at European population trends, you see population growth in Western Europe and decline in Eastern Europe. And this is partly, as you can see on the graph to the right, to do with birth rates, but it's a lot to do with migration as well. The graph on the left is the population of Ukraine in blue, vis-a-vis the population of England in, I think it's orange. I'm a little colorblind, but that looks orange. So essentially, you know, as you're aware, Eastern Europe functions to some extent as a reserve army of labor for Western Europe, but then some of the army comes, puts down roots, settles, and stays. Now, is this demographic polarization in Europe, is this a sign that free movement has not led to a convergence of living standards? I would say not really. The evidence is really quite mixed on this. If you look at wages, Eastern Europe has converged, and this is not wages on the slide, by the way, this is just population numbers and population growth. But turning to wages, Eastern Europe wages have converged to some extent with Western Europe, and this is partly to do with free labor flows in the EU. But Southern Europe has not. Here, there has been a divergence between the South and the North. And yet then if you go on to look at life expectancy, which is, I think, as solid a measure of the quality of life as you're ever going to find in one number. If you look at life expectancy, you see that for Southern Europe, life expectancy has converged with the West, while Eastern Europe is lagging very far behind. And I'm not exactly sure why this is, whether it's to do with the collapsed health services in countries like Romania, or is it to do with levels of alienation and despair, and as they manifest then in smoking and heavy drinking? I'm not entirely sure. There's an anomaly on smoking, which is Greece. In Greece, there's quite a high smoking rate and high life expectancy. I don't know why that is. Anyway, I'm just beginning with some of these conundrums and paradoxes and strange phenomena of migration. There are so many paradoxes. If you look at ethnic enclaves, for example, which I've been studying with my students on migration recently, should one look at them as a location of immigrant solidarity, as migrants kind of carve their interests and needs into an urban space, creating it in such a way that they can find their bearings and flourish in this strange new world? Or are they creations of racism? Are they ghettos that then entrench the othering of immigrants? Many of these contradictions revolve around a fundamental one, which is that migration on the one hand is all about human beings trying to improve their lives, expand their horizons, and so on, to flourish. But on the other hand, migration is defined and regulated by institutions, by capital, by states. It's functional for them. Indeed, it is a core part of their makeup. An increasing number of studies in the field of migration studies is looking at this. When I started grappling with these issues some years ago, I began by looking at the case for open borders, as was advanced by a brilliant theorist of migration called Nigel Harris in London. He's someone I've long admired, but on this issue, I really disagree with him. He sees, in his take on this question of open borders and migration control, economic interests he posits as liberal, progressive, universalists. Capital basically is pushing the world toward open borders. Political structures are what's holding it back history. States are reactionary, they're racist, they're nationalist, they build walls, they build fences, they hire people to join the border control and so on. They imprison people, they impede historical process, they're turning the clock back. You get a sense of his position from this quote here. All right, I'm going to have to deal with this increasingly irritating little thing. Think of the glorious 19th century and the preceding century. So that must be the 16th, 17th, and 18th. With their gloriously uncontrolled migration across the Americas and all around the British Empire. And he contrasts that with the 20th century, the age of xenophobia, policing movement, the age of border control. And how does that cash out in policy terms? Well, you get a sense of it in this BBC piece that he did. And here he's saying, especially here, in Britain, we need open borders because British people are getting old and they need looking after. They are cricking their backs and needing care. And they need migrant workers to come and look after them. We're not going to be able to find enough British people to staff the hospitals and care homes at low enough wages to make this financially viable. So this is the way a Marxist like Nigel Harris sort of turns towards liberalism via this argument on open borders that he made so brilliantly and so forcefully, but so misguidedly, in my view. Now, it's easy to debunk his historical argument. It's a little harder to propose an alternative, but I want to begin with that historical argument. All right, virtually uncontrolled migration in the 19th century and previous centuries. Well, how, Professor Harris, does the slave trade fit here exactly? I mean, you can get rid of the problem through definitions. You can say that slavery is not migration because it is forced. You can categorize it as the export-import of people. I mean, that's fair enough. That's plausible enough if you want to go down that road. But if you do go down that road, you then have to ask yourself, well, what exactly replaced slavery? At least in the British Empire, which is the empire I know best, and which, to some extent defined the world of the 19th century. In the British Empire, what replaced slavery? Indentured labor. Millions of workers shipped from India and China to all corners of the globe. And there was something common to slavery and indenture, which was that private capital took charge of controlling mobility on the global stage in the 18th into the 19th century. This was usually merchant capital buying and incarcerating slaves, kidnapping indentured workers or deceiving them, lying to them, and keeping them then in debt bondage. And all of this was undertaken hand in glove with the imperial state. A classic example is India. In India, the colonial authorities forced peasants to pay tax, which many of them couldn't afford. And then they are forced to sell themselves into debt bondage, AKA as international migrants in this virtually uncontrolled migration. But this uncontrolled migration regime, supposedly, of the 19th century. Now, I would argue, and I've been arguing this for a long time, but this argument has been brilliantly made recently by Radhika, I forget the second name, I'm so sorry, it's a brilliant book. Radhika, anyway. she makes the argument that
Decide.
indentured labor was the first migration regime. So I'm moving on to look at the concept of migration regimes here. What we saw was the East India Company teaming up with the British state, and the state monitored the overall regime that the East India Company and other merchant capitalists were operating. And when the state was challenged in this role, it justified its role by saying, really explicitly, by saying it needs to regulate the migration of indentured labor to ensure that it was free. So what you see here is the British state, which had administered the slave trade for so many years, but then turned against slavery, using partly a language of emancipation, liberation. Then when it starts setting up an alternative migration regime to replace the flow of slaves with the flow of indentured laborers, a flow which is not as forceful and brutal as the slave trade, but still involved a lot of fraud and force. Well, the British state now justifies it in terms of freedom. This is a free market in migration, and this is why we as the state are engaging in it. I encountered recently a story within this wider picture of the 19th century of the 150,000 children, English and mainly Scottish, who were kidnapped, actually kidnapped by merchants, and later on by the British state. This was not just in the 19th, it was between the 17th century and the 20th century. Actually, this kidnapping was still going on in my childhood, which it feels like ancient history sometimes, but is not all that long ago. It's still just astounding. Kids who were being kidnapped by capitalists and by the state, deported to the colonies and the dominions, many of them to Christian rape camps in Australia. And I'm using a lurid term here, rape camp, but it's possibly an exaggeration, but not by much, because the studies of this, they show that in some of these institutions, a majority of the kids were systematically raped by the clerics in charge. In fact, the origin of the term kidnap, by the way, just a little digression there, of which there are many in this talk, I'm sorry. The origin of the term kidnap was to refer to this practice of stealing or napping children to send to the American and Australian colonies, to send them as servants and laborers and basically sex slaves of priests and Protestant ministers. Now, I've introduced some of the pillars of success of the British Empire in setting up this migration regime. The British Empire's success, it's often talked of in terms of power, profit, and proselytism, the way in which the state, business, and the church were institutionalized as autonomous centers of power, but were each of which was independently able to roam around the empire, but whose interests coalesced very, very strongly, and each of them could take a lead in certain operations, but they'd act in concert. The Kids to the Colonies programs is a case in point. The moment of kidnapping the kids was justified by the church and state in religious terms and in elitist terms to punish women for having given birth out of wedlock. That's why we're permitted to steal your children. And to punish the poor for having had too many kids, a sort of Malthusian argument, we can steal your children for this reason. And then the journey to Australia, America, was organized by these three groups in concert to provide white labor for the operations in the colonies. So this is a process of organizing exploitation and racial engineering in the colonies. Keep Australia white. We have enough white people here in Britain. We can get rid of a few of the shit ones that we don't want here, and it'll help keep your colony as white as possible. That was the argument being made. It's a win-win for the white racists in Britain, so this reminds us that white settler colonialism was all about the genocide of Aboriginal populations and subjugating Black and brown people. But some white people, at least these poor little children, could be minced up by it as well. All right, so this period that I've been talking about, British colonization, European colonization of the world, set up a world economy with a migration regime as the lifeblood of the world economy, as its basis. and a regime that was structured in the interests of the colonial powers. And in some ways, this is what Diana was talking about earlier in a modern incarnation of it. In some ways, this basic structure persists up to the present. And in migration studies, there's increasing interest in the coloniality of migration regimes. Lucy Mablin argues, it's all right, I'll deal with it. Lucy Mablin argues this, you can read on the screen. Basically, she argues that the migration regime today and the refugee regime are essentially the same pattern as in colonial times. And she is reminding us of something important, but it's not quite accurate what she's saying, is it? I mean, the nature of mobility and immobility was in some ways quite importantly different in colonial times, when the stronger tendency was West European settlers traveling to other continents, again, like in Diana's example, and Asians and Africans were being moved around the world, as I described earlier, in the indentured labor schemes and so on, but precisely not to Europe. Another thing about Mablin's thesis, it's brilliant. I recommend her book, or books now, but she doesn't really draw out the importance of capitalism enough, I think. I mean, look, for 5,000 years, give or take, before capitalism, there were empires in various continents of the world, in most continents. There was lots of colonization, no shortage of colonies, but there was nothing like the migration regimes that the European empires set up in the modern era. And so we have to be aware of, I think, of that distinctively capitalist form of colonial migration regimes in the modern period. You see, one of the paradoxes that I touched on earlier was that capitalism emerged in a colonial world, and it reproduced and consolidated colonial division, even as it was pushing toward a new political order centered on nation states, a nation state system. So colonial structures found themselves sublated in this new cosmos of bourgeois sovereignty. Now, so I'm speaking now of migration regimes having, I think I said just then, they have a capitalist form, and that might not be clear, so I should explain. By capitalism, I mean the society that arose, give or take a century, in the 17th century, globalized in subsequent centuries, a social system governed by the drive to accumulate capital, compelled by market competition, and also indirectly through geopolitical competition, in which workers are doubly free of the means of production and free to choose their employer, famously, and in which states tend to take the national form. And in the system, wage labor and capital are mutually constitutive, but they're also constituted themselves through state power and vice versa. So states and capital stand against wage labor as the alienated form of their own powers. But as the nation state evolves, workers are co-opted into or integrated into states in this national form. They're imprinted with national consciousness. And this national form carries the imprint of the colonial era. So by talking about capitalist migration regimes, I'm not trying to suggest there's a typical migration regime in capitalism. I've got a very broad view of capitalism, including lots of different types of society. Even Romania under Ceausescu in my book was capitalist. So migration regimes similarly are very variable. They're often informal, such as the management of labor mobility in the British Empire that I was talking about earlier. They're sometimes formal and highly rule governed, like the migration regime in the EU, both internally and towards its neighbors to the south. And you can, I'm still thinking about capitalist migration regimes. You can find obviously some similarities between attitudes to immigration in capitalist societies and in pre-capitalist societies. Go back to ancient Athens. I was reading recently Xenophon, his book Ways and Means, ancient Greece. He was calling for Athens to take measures to encourage immigration, and for reasons we hear today, they'll bring money to the coffers of the city. and incidentally, another little digression, he mentioned Syrians in this connection. He mentioned people from Syria, or what would the area known as Syria today, and he was encouraging to come to Athens. He was kind of the Angela Merkel of his day, although unlike Merkel, he had actually traveled around Syria. I don't think she has. All right, so pre-capitalist societies, ancient Greece, wherever, they knew lots of movement. In some places at some times, there was pastoral nomadism, there were peoples fleeing armies or the invading armies themselves. There were settlers coming in their wake. There was colonization, ancient Greece, for example, and so on. In many empires, most of them that you look at, Tang China, all the way to the Aztecs, lots of peasants were moving around. But this was mostly internal migration. It was not international by and large. It was largely from the villages to the towns, and some urban elites sailing off to the periphery to trade, to preach, to rule, and so on. So what I'm arguing is I'm trying to work out what is distinctive about migration in capitalism. And I think there are 6 things. So I'll just go through them quickly. Firstly, migration regimes in capitalism, well, the dominant form of labor is wage labor, and so much migration is labor migration. It's sort of normal labor mobility, but extending across borders. Secondly, accumulation is relentlessly competitive, so all economic factors are continuously being recalibrated by the people in charge. And because most labor is wage labor, so it's contracted, it's in principle mobile, its owners in theory own it and can move it elsewhere. That means the supply is always uncertain, and employers have to be continually concerned to ensure the mobility of workers to their industries. And the reproduction of the workforce is intensively managed by states. This is ultimately why capitalism is the reign of biopower, the enrolling of individuals into the administration of their bodies in a kind of market conforming way. Thirdly, capitalism forms globally, so you have the tendency to the formation of a global labor market and a global migration regime. Fourthly, the political order natural to capitalism is the nation-state system, and it has very unusual borders. Nation-states have sharply defined borders which replace the fuzzy and fluid borders of the past, and in capitalism, migration is often between nations, unlike in previous systems. Fifthly, racism is a capitalist colonial project. Capitalism, in that it unleashes these forces of unbridled exploitation and polarization, but at the same time, ideologies of liberté, égalité, fraternité. From that contradiction grows the crucial ideological importance of racism, which becomes a pivotal form of power a pivotal instrument of social control, which justifies elite domination. It fragments working people within a racially constructed global hierarchy. It devalues the labor of colonized people, and it continually creates surplus populations, as Diana was referring to them, for expropriation, for particular humiliation in the interests of this hierarchy. And global migration regimes in capitalism form around this project. I've been talking a lot about states and capital controlling and policing migrants, ensuring the reproduction of labor, building fences around them, ensuring that some sort of mobility takes place, but that the workers themselves have particular attributes. I realize I've been speaking about this in a similar way to referring to dairy farmers overseeing the welfare and the reproduction of their livestock. And to some extent, that's a useful lens, but unlike cattle, of course, migrants interpret and contest the terms of their supply and their remuneration and their reproduction. And confronting this, the elements of class struggle within migration was, I think, a crucial part of what took place above all also in the 19th century. So this is sort of my favorite century for understanding migration regimes, which is that this was the century of the formation of nation states out of old empires, and of the nationalization of labor market competition, especially in Western Europe and North America. This was the critical moment, the late 19th century, this condensation of extraordinary forces taking place at the same time: inter-imperialist competition, scientific racism, polyethnic hierarchies being reconstituted on the basis of the nation state, states increasingly supervising and intervening in industry and engaging in welfare. And then you see the rise of class struggle, labor movements, the so-called social question. This was the backdrop where creating an infrastructure of belonging to the nation really institutionalized a kind of fake class struggle around immigration control, where states sought to take on the mantle of the protector of their nation in opposition to Johnny Foreigner, in a project that stirred together xenophobia and welfare, and is absolutely central to understanding how immigration control has emerged, has developed since then. And immigration control really is the central pillar of state sovereignty, increasingly since then. The state is the judge, the arbiter, the institution that sets the rules: who is in and who is out, which ethnicities are welcome and which are not, who is an economic migrant and who is a refugee. Which reminds me, I talked of the 6 points that define capitalist migration regimes, and I forgot to mention the 6th and last one, which is this: in capitalism, political and economic power tend to be institutionalized separately. And we see this in migration regimes increasingly as well. The separate regime formation or regimentation of migrant labor and of refugees. So the migrant regime, the migration regime, it evolved historically out of regimes for regulating the mobility of the laboring poor. And so migration regimes, in that sense, inherit these centuries of conservative disgust toward the laboring poor. And migrant is obviously associated with the low skilled, the low wage, the global poor. If you're a professional from New York arriving in London, you get called an expat, not a migrant. But then in the 1920s, 1930s, we begin to see a formalized distinction between refugees and migrants. In those interwar years, an emerging refugee regime was constructed. It focused initially on facilitating the entry of refugees into existing labor migration channels. So to sort of legitimize them, to assist them by helping them gain the right to survive as laborers. And the ILO, the International Labour Organization, in the 1920s was acted as a labor exchange for refugees. The idea was that funneling them into the labor market is the most protective gift you can give to a refugee. It was offering security. But then what happened? That was the 1920s. Then the 1930s happened, and labor migration everywhere was squeezed. Refugees were no longer welcome as workers in the rich countries, or the impoverished, temporarily impoverished rich countries. And so what you see then, especially with the intervening Second World War of major importance, obviously, when the refugee regime was then formalized in 1951, it was defined now by a very sharp separation from any economic migration regime. You can look at this as well from the angle of suffering. Suffering is seen as legitimate in refugee terms if it's political, but not economic. Economic suffering is a motivation for labor migration. It's not something you can legitimately flee with the hope of expectation in another country and deserving protection. So I just want to still on the question of refugee, I've moved on from migration regimes in general to refugee regimes. Just want to make a couple of points here. In practice, I think I've already hinted at this, the refugee channel obviously bleeds into the labor migration channel. This is obviously the case in respect of the lives of the migrants themselves, most of whom don't really conceive of themselves as migrants or as refugees and so on. These are terms inherent to the regime, not to the individual. But this bleeding together of the two processes also occurs in the discourse in host countries. States strategically deploy a blurring of refugee and migrant at certain times to suit their interests. I'll just give you a few examples. In the 5 years after the Second World War, 100,000 workers from Eastern Europe were taken from displaced persons camps in Central Europe and recruited directly to work in Britain. And so these were refugees getting taken into a managed sort of economic migration program. Or think about the integration of Syrians into the German economy in the 7 years ago or so. In one sense, and certainly very much at face value, this was a humanitarian offer to war-terrorized refugees, and marks a contrast to Germany's reception of Gastarbeiter in the previous era, the way Italians, Greeks, Yugoslavs, Turks in the 1950s through the 1980s came to Germany under a contract labor program. This distinction between the Syrians on the one hand and the Gastarbeiter on the other is legitimate. There's a truth to it, but in practice, the welcome was also heavily influenced. The welcome to Syrians was heavily influenced by demand for labor from Germany's business community. And I mean, if you look at this whole historical process on a map, it's quite graphic. You see first the Italians, then I should have put a slide up on this, then the Yugoslavs, then the Greeks, then further east, the Turks. Then there's a bit of a hiatus because East Germans come. And then another hiatus because Yugoslav refugees come in the 90s, and then the Poles and Czechs. But after that, finally moving eastwards from Turkey, you have the next country, which is the Syrians. They arrive as well. So you can see it from that angle as well. I'm not disputing that these were also seen as genuine and welcomed as genuine refugees at the same time. A third example, Poland and its reception to refugees from Ukraine. Already in 2015 till 2020, 11% of Poland's GDP growth was credited directly to Ukrainian migrants. That's data from Poland's central bank. And now another 1.2 million Ukrainian refugees come. This has their absorption, of course, has been not easy. There have been housing shortages, a great deal of charity given and charity fatigue. But the influx into Poland into the Polish labor market has been a boon for Polish employers. So that's one point, one additional point on refugees I wanted to make. A second one is that I've been talking about the refugee regime as it was founded after the Second World War, and it was infused with a humanitarian spirit, as we all know. Less well known is the ways in which it reproduced colonial practices of domination. I mean, it's extraordinary when you look at it. The scope of the 1951 Refugee Convention was limited expressly to refugee movements resulting from events, I quote, occurring in Europe prior to the 1st of January 1951. So we celebrate its rhetoric of profound concern for refugees, protecting people who are suffering. We celebrate that universalism and inclusivity, and yet when it was written only with white European refugees in mind. Now, increasingly then, from that basis, the refugee regime has developed of course, a colonial perspective. The idea is to acknowledge refugees, but restrict them as far as possible to stay in the global south where most of the wars are taking place. Keep them away, protect them from the public, protect the public from the sight of homeless refugees on the streets. And this operation works in various ways. Obviously migration laws that prevent refugees ever reaching a northern border. Combine that with the absence of any humanitarian visa regime that would actually allow people to fly to northern states and apply for asylum, fly or take a boat or whatever. And then on top of that, the states of the north are busy devising policies deliberately, explicitly for containing refugees in their regions. And on top of, finally, you know, if you're fleeing serious harm, then usually the first option is to just go across the border, which usually means stay in the global south. Now, in Europe, this pattern broke down a little during the Yugoslav wars, and it threatened to break down dramatically during the war in Syria. That refugee flow was solved for the EU in its shabby deal with Turkey, which blocked the routes for refugees seeking to travel to Europe. In Britain, incidentally, the right-wing press reframed the Syrian refugee crisis as a migrant crisis. These were migrants, not refugees, for the British right-wing community. In Poland, we saw Afghans and Syrians allowed to rot at the border with Belarus, in a widely noted contrast to the welcome that was afforded to Ukrainians. And many of these people actually died. I mean, this was, and assisting them was a criminal offense. But then this pattern of containing refugees in the south or across the border in Belarus, this has broken down again with the Ukraine war. Something I find interesting is that if you look at the coordinates of Ukraine and Syria, they're quite identical in some ways. Kharkiv and Damascus are on the same meridian. But more importantly, before the wars, their per capita GDP was near identical. It was 3,100 in Syria, $3,600 in Ukraine, almost the same. Both countries had been colonies. Both countries were bombed by Russia. Both wars caused massive refugee flows, but the receptions were extraordinarily different. I mean, I'm sure everyone is very aware of this, and I'll be interested in hearing from you, because as a country bordering Ukraine, you know much more about this than I do. Certainly in Britain, there was no significant welcome given to Syrians, whereas for Ukrainians, the welcome was pretty actually limited, but it was sentiment laden and very upfront welcoming in a sense. In Poland, there was no welcome for Syrians at all, against a very substantial and in many respects, especially from the population, extremely generous welcome for Ukrainians. Australia is the classic example here. Australia is encouraging Ukrainians to come on a regular visa. Think about that. If you're fleeing Russian bombs in Kyiv, you can take a plane to Sydney and get a job. If you're fleeing Russian bombs in Aleppo, go to Australia and you will be tortured in Nauru. You'll sew your lips together on Nauru. It's absolutely astonishing, the contrast. I mean, this comes fairly close to a social science experiment to test the influence of racism on refugee reception in Western countries. It's not a perfect test, obviously, because Russia's war in Ukraine was a simple invasion of a sovereign nation. Russia's bombing in Syria was intervening in a civil war, and the West didn't so clearly take a side in Syria as it has done on Ukraine. So it's not, so that's an important aspect as well, but still. All right, how long have I been speaking for? 40 minutes or more already, so I better get to the final section, which is climate refugees. climate refugee, the period we're entering historically is going to be increasingly roiled by climate chaos. And already today, the 50 million people who are displaced by climate-related disasters, they outnumber those who are fleeing political persecution. Some projections say between now and 2050, so the next 30 years, we're going to see around 1.2 billion people, that's with a B, displaced by climate change. You have to be a bit skeptical of these figures because measuring the role of climate change in a case of flooding or a crop failure, it's not easy. So the estimates of numbers can vary a lot, but whatever estimate you look at, the numbers are absolutely staggering. So what this means is the battle is only going to grow over whether climate displaced people qualify for recognition as refugees. Climate change, I think, is going to insinuate its way into all social conflict. And the war in Syria was a portent of this. It was a conflict with some climate-related causal factors. If you look across the Sahel, you see the same conflicts related to climate change. The climate crisis is going to test the limits of the existing conceptual frame regarding migration and regarding migration regimes. Why? Because the defining norm in migration regimes is there's a clear separation between migrant labor and refugees. Migration is voluntary, displacement is forced. Voluntary migrants don't need our protection, forced displaced people do. To liberals, it's absolutely imperative that this line is upheld very strongly. Here's an example. Here is a liberal in Britain in the Guardian newspaper, Nick Cohen, arguing, you've got to be cruel to migrants to be kind to refugees. You've got to be. But the problem with this argument that's up on the screen is that you can't, or one of many problems is that you can't treat migrants as a threat and as a source of fear without this spilling over onto refugees too. And we're seeing this, I think, increasingly today. The term refugee is increasingly, for some sections of society, being viewed pejoratively in a similar way to migrants. But more generally, this divide between refugees and migrants was always problematic because it rests on liberalism's axiom that the only freedom worth its name is negative liberty. Socialists respond, if you're being driven from your home by famine, that's just as violent as being driven out by conflict or persecution. Now, one of the things that makes this a fascinating topic at the moment, climate refugees, is the no agreement really on whether these people should deserve the title, the status of refugee. Well, there is agreement. They're not receiving that, but the term is increasingly used. There's no internationally agreed definition of refugee. Let's remind ourselves of that. Legally, the most influential is the convention that I mentioned to you, the 1951 convention. It states that the legitimate causes of flight are persecution on the grounds of race, religion, nationality, or membership of a particular social group or political opinion. So it's basically persecution and war. But there's a very broadly accepted definition that includes people being forced to flee natural disasters. Even the Oxford English Dictionary uses this definition, and so it's, it has some sort of establishment backing, even though it's not international law, and it's widely used. And what climate change is going to do is make this legal exclusion of natural disasters from the legal definition. It's going to make that more problematic in several respects. Now, those who defend the status quo are going to hit back. They're going to say, look, someone who's a refugee needs protection from their state. Their state is persecuting them, or their state is conflicted in civil war, and they're fleeing that. The role of the state is to care for the population, and their states are unable to do that. In a natural disaster, say the Conservatives, and liberals, most of them, the state can take measures to respond. But this argument is going to become increasingly problematic as climate change begins to rack entire regions of countries, begins to undermine the ability of states to respond effectively, and ultimately will begin to make entire countries uninhabitable. And at the same time, this concept of natural disaster is crumbling before our eyes. Climate change is anthropogenic, and therefore climate disasters are too. The recent floods in Pakistan tell me which people driven from their homes were driven from their homes by nature and which were driven from their homes by the burning of fossil fuels. There's an author of these crises, and it's not nature, it's the rich world. And you can measure the contributions of different countries in their cumulative carbon emissions. Therefore, responsibility for refugee flows from natural disasters can be assigned. This, I think, is one reason why the term climate refugee is politically a more useful term than environmental refugee. Is the term, are climate refugees going to be legally recognized as refugees? There's a debate on this at the moment. In the last few years, we've seen some optimism in United Nations bodies. In the COP process, the climate change is recognized now since the Paris Agreement as the driver of disaster risk. And the Paris Agreement explicitly drew states' attention to their need to protect rights of migrants who've been displaced by climate change. And then we've seen in the last 4 years the Global Compact for Refugees being signed, and it was signed by hundreds of states. Only America and Hungary did not voted against it. That was America under Trump. And global compacts such as this have been recognizing climate change as a driver of human mobility. The UN Human Rights Committee has been saying similar things. But so there's a normative change going on in these intergovernmental organizations, but the agreements being signed are non-binding. The states that signed up are not obliged to do anything. So what that means is that the status of climate migrants remains muddled. And I think the left should be, which is where I sit, should be arguing that these are refugees, not migrants, even though we dislike the starkness of the divide, but in reality, we have to recognize the divide does matter, and refugees need recognition. But what we're seeing now is the political right becoming vocal on this issue. For many years, they neglected questions of climate migration. After all, climate change is an exaggeration for them. So the issue was discussed in left-wing terms. Migrants, it's part of the solution to climate change, migration. It's an adaptation strategy by vulnerable people. But this is changing. The issue is getting securitized. It's getting whipped up as a threat to national security, discussed alongside terrorism and so on in the British press, for example. So I think we're going to see this as part of the discourse of driving up increasing militarization of borders, increasing pushback of refugees to where they came from, and denial of refugee status. I fear that we're going to see more and more of. That's the prognosis that I would, I'm afraid, draw. Finally, some concluding thoughts. I know I've been speaking too long. I'm really sorry, but I'll just 3 more minutes. I just wanted to try and draw some things, raise some questions and draw some threads together in response to the terms of your conference, which is crisis, war, and alternative futures. So the era, as I understand it, the era of capitalism that we're enjoying at the moment is going to be increasingly dominated by US hegemonic decline. Obviously, at the moment, the dollar is on a high and America is gaining from the Ukraine war. And obviously, China's growth, the main rival, its growth has been hit by the zero COVID policy. But that same policy also has helped China, for the first time ever, overtake the United States on life expectancy. And I think that's a really big deal. The old hegemon cannot look after its own population, especially Black people, Native Americans, Hispanics. It can't look after them on the most fundamental question of life that's even written in its constitution. the right to life, at least longevity of life, America is slipping on. This slip down to 76 years life expectancy, by the way, it's worse in America than pretty much anywhere else, but it's similar in most of Europe, certainly Britain, certainly Romania. Not quite as extreme, but it's pretty bad. Romania's gone down from 75 to 74 or something, a little lower than America, but not far off. So we live in this hegemonic interregnum, I would suggest, and as hegemonic stability theory would predict, we're in a period of great instability. The Ukraine war maybe is a sign of this. I'd be very glad if you can persuade me otherwise. The period is also going to be dominated by climate crisis, as I've been discussing, and other environmental signs of environmental ruination, like the increase of pandemics. Profitability in the coming years and decades, I think, is likely to be low. This is world profit rates. Profit is the motor of the system, and its general direction is heading south again. And this translates into low growth, per capita growth rates of GDP. I culled this data from the World Bank. The y-axis is percentage growth in each decade. And I don't see a reason why this is going to head back up again. Some years ago, in 2009, the economist Michael Roberts predicted we'd see a Kondratiev upturn and a new long upswing in profitability and growth. Michael Roberts predicted back then that it would start in 2015 or 2018, but I can see no sign of it at all, and I see no reason to believe it's going to happen. What does this mean for migration and migration regimes? I realize I haven't shaped a conclusion very carefully and artfully. So I'll just leave it at that. If anyone's interested in the background and the sort of some of the articles and books that I've been culling this talk from, these are some of the ones that I've produced on this topic. And I'll leave it at that. I've spoken too long. I'm very sorry about that. I've spoken too quickly likewise. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Gareth, for your engaging talk and for this tour de force to this concept of migration regime and the history of migration regimes, and just opening the discussion towards these hot topics of the day regarding Ukrainian refugees, the war, and climate crisis. I will now open our lecture to questions or comments coming from the public here or at home, online, if there are questions. And I actually have one. You said that at some point you operate, as we are in capitalism, somehow we have to deal with this problem of institutionalization, of the separation of power between politics and economy, something like that, I think. And I was wondering if you can maybe expand a bit on that, how this separate institutionalization, what this separate institutionalization means for migrants, refugees, and future climate refugees. What types of contradictions these movements shed light a bit? Now, first question until I'm sure there will be others.
What's the pattern you're applying? Is it the speaker responds to every question individually, or do you gather questions?
Individually.
Individually, okay.
They come from different backgrounds, and you will be simply involved.
Okay. All right. Okay. So, well, thanks for the question, Dana. All right. So, the separation of politics and economics. I should just begin by saying there are differences among Marxists on this, as you're aware, and some see this as absolutely the defining feature of capitalist society, and Karl Polanyi does as well. I'm not of that camp. I think key to capitalism is basically expropriation of labor as wage labor and capital accumulation. But I do recognize that this is, but at the same time, I recognize that this is a major tendency in capitalism and very strongly represented in the most liberal forms of capitalism. So we see that this separation as at its greatest extent in the liberal heartlands of the capitalist world, and in peripheral countries, you tend to see more a sort of crushing together of political and economic power in the form of state capital. But moving on to your question in how this relates to migration and refugees, I think what I was trying to do really was just to think through why the division between labor migrants and refugees has become institutionalized quite differently. And there are various reasons for that. There's the sort of argument around protection for refugees and the voluntary motivation of labor migrants. But I think also the fact that the worldview, especially of the dominant outlook within capitalist society, and especially within liberal instances of it, particularly the sorts of intergovernmental organizations where these regimes are drawn up and pushed and sanctioned and so on. There it's absolutely common sense that this is the central division of the world between the world governed by states and the world of civil society, of private business, where different rules can apply. And in terms of migration regimes, I think the genius of most migration regimes is that you have a game being played between public power and private business, the state and capital, tugging at one another's interests to some extent, perhaps, but between them, constituting this nationalized labor market and racialized migration regime, which acts powerfully in the interests of both. Indeed, for states, it's part of their very constitution, drawing up the borders and policing the borders. And when I was looking then into the history of the development of migration regimes in the 19th century, this really brought home the point even more forcefully, that it was born from the sort of contradictions between basic commonalities of, in the case of the British Empire, the British state and the East India Company, working together and yet tugging apart a little bit as well. So I mentioned this distinction primarily in order to help me analytically understand migration regimes and capitalism. In respect of future of climate refugees, I don't have much to add on that, apart from what I've already said, I'm afraid. But thanks for the question.
Fine, I just wanted to make sure you're not
Thanks, Alexander, and thanks, Gareth, for the talk. It was very interesting. I don't know very much about the topic, but I hope my questions are intelligible. So the first is a question of clarification. I thought I heard you say that sort of racism, you put it, how was it that you put it? The combination of the unbridled forces of exploitation and enlightenment values generated something. Enlightenment, you refer to liberté, égalité, fraternité as I'm calling them enlightened values. you refer to the combination of these two as the kind of forces that moved racism forward. And I don't know. I don't know if I understand, if I'm understanding it correctly.
Shall I
claim?
Shall I elaborate a little bit on it?
Yeah,
and then you can
thanks.
come back once I've explained. So this is what is a fairly standard argument, and one that I find pretty convincing, which is that racism emerged essentially in the process of colonization of the New World by Western European powers. And now one has to then ask the question, well, lots of empires have undertaken colonizations and colonialism in previous historical eras. What was it now about this happening in the middle of the last millennium that made it so different, that led to racism, unlike the sort of previous forms of exclusion and domination that you know, can be xenophobic and you know, pejorative towards the barbarians and that sort of thing, but not an elaborated form of racialization and racial categorization, which is how we understand racism and where the term has come from. Now, why did that occur then in the middle of the last millennium? The argument I've heard and read and find very convincing is that there's something about capitalism which on the one hand leads to a brutal expropriation in the colonies and brutal exploitation of labor, which one has to justify, but capitalism finds it harder to justify that than previous societies, which because in capitalism you have the principle of equality of human beings. There's a universalism to liberal, that sort of fundamentally liberal aspect of capitalism, right? Which is universal, which is egalitarian, which is in a sense humanitarian. And so if you bring together that ideology, of which I summarized very quickly as liberté, égalité, fraternité, if you bring that together with the actual enacted brutal exploitation and expropriation of people, you need to find something very radical to justify that. And that's the task that racism was invented to produce, to perform.
Thank you. So should I take it? Thanks. I suppose then my follow-up question to that would be, how should we understand those emancipatory projects that happened, especially in the second half of the 18th century and in the first half of the 19th century, that appeal to those values to carry out things? The famous letter from Louverture in the 1794 assembly to the French Assembly saying, you speak of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Liberty for whom? Equality for whom? Fraternity amongst whom? Right? And I not just that, right? The entire set of revolutions in Latin America that were also integrating those values to some extent. That I don't know. Yeah, I'd be interested to hear how those figure into that story, right? Because it seems like those values then are playing for two teams in a way, right? They're playing for a team that justifies the exploitation of those economies, while at the same time being internalized by the groups that are opposing those forces and reacting to them.
Right. I'm not sure if I was phrasing it in that way that you just stated, that those ideas of emancipation were being applied by team racism. Rather, I was pointing to a contradiction in the mind. Imagine if you're a planter in the Caribbean and you see yourself as a Christian and basically a liberal, a believer in civilization. You're part of the British, say it's the British Empire, just because that's the one closest to me. You belong to the British Empire, a marvelous liberal institution committed to raising the civilizational level of the world through our industry and through our marvelous laws and through our glittering culture. And you go to church each Sunday and perceive yourself as a very decent man, usually it would be a man, But then from Monday to Saturday, you're whipping your slaves until the blood is running down their backs. How do you justify that to yourself? Well, the way this is the contradiction you're operating within. I'm not saying that you're applying the ideas of liberty and equality to I'm not saying that racism comes directly from those ideas at all. It's that contradiction. They help construct the space of the contradiction in which the ideology, out of which the ideology of racism then arises, because you can then say, well, this person is not really a human being. And that's what racism enables you to do. And that's the way you can then sleep at night. You say, well, I was just you know, I don't lose sleep if I crush a mosquito, and the slave driver doesn't lose sleep if he whips a slave, because that slave has been racialized, has had his or her value as a human being deprived through the ideology of racism. That enables you to stick to some ideas of liberté, égalité, enlightenment.
Okay, we have two questions from the room, and then we'll have one from someone that is online. So Milici, you have to wait a bit because there are two questions ahead of you, and then I'll give you the opportunity to ask the question. So Florin,
thank you, Dana. Thanks a lot, Gera, for this very engaging and important contribution to our overall debate in this conference. I have three very quick questions. The first one relates also to my presentation at the beginning of this conference, because I was mentioning there in the context of narratives of decline of EU and the crisis of the EU, this notion of migration and the refugee crisis. And we have a lot of authors who identified migration and the refugees as potential terminal crisis for the EU, either from the right, which means
potential terminal crisis.
Yeah, like bringing down the EU. It's like an issue that can bring down the EU as it is today. From the right wing, it means mortal cultural danger, right? The migrants will come and they will destroy, migrants and refugees then will come and they will destroy the European fiber and our traditions and so on and so forth, the well-known discussion. On the left side, it means the crashing down of the European ideals of being able to incorporate people, to offer assistance, to make space for everybody, to offer a chance of living, to get rid of the shameful thing that is happening, for example, in the Mediterranean, right? People, thousands of people, if not tens of thousands of people dying every year there, right? So this is, again, as a sort of symbol of the death of the European Enlightenment project. So from these two angles, migration and refugees are a problem. And my question would be here, to what extent, so why is that such an important issue? What is actually at stake in these debates about migration and refugees and the need to either control or open the borders, right? What is the secret that this hides? Is it really a case of racism, that Europe is a racist continent, as it used to be historically, right? The whole birth of Europe as a modern concept and so on. It's a racist construct. And we had some examples very nice today about how this was historically constructed. Or is it more the case that what we witness now is actual collapse of European capitalism? It's an impossibility of European capitalism, which is in, again, terminal crisis, very small growth in the Eurozone in the last decades. It's an inability to incorporate labor and people more generally, right? So what we have, in fact, it's not necessarily racism, but it's more like a deep economic crisis that somehow it's hidden by this racism, both on the right and on the left, right? Because it's very easy as a leftist to say, oh, this is racism, Europe is absolutely shit because it doesn't like brown people or African people, but in fact, it might be a deeper cut than that, which is an economic crisis. And I was wondering, what's your thoughts on this? And then two more points. One is about the concept of climate refugees, which I think will be more and more important, as you rightfully mentioned. And what I was wondering, what kind of agency or state agency or some sort of supernatural agency will be necessary to deal with this, because I think when we talk about climate refugees, I think we should take into account perhaps the fact that in most cases there will be instances of states collapsing, right? So we'll not have a state capacity any longer. If you move large parts of the population, that means that the states that are coming from, it's gone. So you need some sort of extra powers of the existing states or some sort of supra state authorities to deal with these climate refugees. And finally, and sorry for taking so long, but the talk was so engaging. How would you integrate in the framework you mentioned here this recent debate, and I think it will flare up even more, about whether we should receive we meaning the Europeans, the nice EU people, the Russians running away now from mandatory draft, right? So you have this two schools of thought. One says we should let the Russians in, fleeing war on Putin, and the others say no, they should suffer because they supported Putin, or if they want to fight Putin, they should stay at home and make a revolution, right? So I was wondering, where do you see this coming into the picture of migration, refugees, and contemporary Europe? Thanks a lot.
Great, thanks for these questions, Florin. Really, all of them really interesting. I'm going to start with I mean, some of them are very complex, and I'll have to think a little bit, but I'll start with the easy one, which is the last one, just to get me going. Yeah, I've heard that there's some debate on whether we enlightened Europeans should receive Russians running away. I mean, well, first of all, I'm not a liberal Nigel Harris style open borders person, but I basically am in favor of free migration. I'm sort of a no borders position, I suppose it would be ultimately conceived. And so, you know, people should be allowed to come anyway. But in particular, I'm just very impressed that so many Russians are trying to flee the draft. If that's what, I assume that that's what they're doing. I haven't actually read many. I've been struggling to finish this damn paper, so I haven't been reading the newspaper and haven't been following the story as well as I should have done. So I can't say much about it, but I gather that a lot of Russians are trying to flee the draft. This is something to celebrate, surely. Of course, they will have had illusions in their war. That's how nationalism works, but you encourage people as they move from a conservative position to a more radical position, which in this case means from supporting the war, if some of them did, which maybe they may well have done, to wanting to save their own skins. This is, I mean, look, in Britain, I'm constantly aware of the surrealism of the world in which we live, because we have just fought a similar war in Iraq, just as brutal. You can argue about which was more brutal or wasn't brutal, but anyway, pretty damn brutal. And also where hydrocarbons was one of the factors in waging the war, just as it has been for Vladimir Putin. And in Britain we have Gordon Brown, who actually sent the troops to Iraq when he was Tony Blair's right-hand man at the time. He's actually calling for Vladimir Putin to be arraigned before an international tribunal. It's completely absurd. But this is what I had in mind thinking about that example is that lots of people in Britain, part of just bourgeois consciousness is having the belief that your state is right. And so if you're Russian in Russia and you believe that your war is good, but then you don't want to be killed in it yourself, I think that's perfectly normal and to be enthusiastically endorsed. And I would personally go to the border if they're coming across this way and give them a hug, would be my response on that question. Even though, of course, I will disagree with them over this or that, but it's great that they're coming. What kind of supranational agency can deal with climate refugee issues when, as states begin to collapse in the global south, as we'll probably see in Haiti? I mean, Cristobal was talking about Toussaint Louverture earlier, and Haiti now is in a dreadful state and will be badly affected by climate change. Pakistan even. I mean, we're not looking at state collapse there, but I give talks. I mean, my major interests are ecological, and I give talks all the time on climate politics. And I'm a bit of a degrowther in my climate politics, and I'm always talking to Western audiences, and it's easy to say then, you know, we need to act radically to you know, our economies have caused this mess. But then a few months ago, I was speaking to a university in Pakistan, and of course you have to sort of, it was a very interesting experience for me, and we were discussing climate change, and just I was saying to them, you know, I'm sorry, I'm from a state that has basically inflicted this. You're one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change now, and they were saying, I know, we just feel so helpless. We can't say anything that will reach the power holders in the states that matter, which is the United States, China, and the European Union, and Britain to a minor extent. We can't say anything. We just feel completely helpless in the face of these disasters that are going to smash into us. And then just a few months later, half of these people that I was speaking to are underwater. And it's just constantly in my mind. And so, you know, states like this are going to start increasingly collapsing and being unable to deal with natural disasters. So then, of course, there will be more imperative on the United Nations to intervene, or this will become part of a interhegemonic competition. Can China or the US act to defend states against natural disasters? I mean, inter-imperialist competition is horrendous, but on this question, one almost hopes that there will be some, if you see what I mean. I mean, that's another way, that's just speculative. I don't really have a good answer to that question, but it's very interesting. Third question, migration and the refugee crisis in Europe. Yeah, I mean, you say, is it economic crisis? Well, the interesting thing that occurred certainly in Britain and probably in much of Europe in the period between the Second World War and now is that you had this period of the Great Boom, and at least in Britain, large-scale immigration from the Third World or global South at a time of very intense racism. And then as the immigrants settle and form bonds with people in their workplaces and their neighborhoods and fight back against the racism gets pushed back against the racism, but migration becomes more and more of a neuralgic issue in this period since the 1970s, really. 1970s in Britain anyway, migration began to become more of a politicized issue in this sense, and that's to do with economic crisis and governments having an interest in saying, you know, don't blame us or the rich, blame the foreigners. So certainly that's part of it. And so when you look at it through that lens, it becomes hard to disentangle economic crisis from racism in a sense. So it's hard to sort of go with one of your the prongs of your argument or the other one of your options or the other.
Okay, thank you, Garrett. We'll take now a question from Lorin, then Boisa, and then Vladimir, and I think we will stop here because it's late.
Yeah, thanks to your talk and the other presentations we had in these 3 days, I guess I have discovered something important. I guess the thing that migration, perhaps, and migration regimes, they really enable you to discover how the whole system works actually. The whole, you know, the inner workings of the system, and I never thought of that. I'm from Romania, and we know a lot of anecdotes about migrating and migration, etc. But I never thought of it other than in this register. So now my question is, and it's born out of frustration actually. You talked about this state and private interest colliding or alienating in different moments in in the form of a migration regime. And my question is here, now that we finally have a European minimum wage, if you can speak a bit on that, as some sort of a break in migration or some, I don't know how to construe this.
Now that we have a European what?
Minimum wage.
Minimum wage.
Yeah.
Will this operate as a brake on migration?
I don't know, maybe. Or what's the point in having now a European minimum wage, as they managed to do it just, I guess, a week ago or 2 weeks ago?
Right. Well, I come from Britain, so you know, we don't get news from Europe anymore. It's suddenly a long way away, and I wasn't even aware. And there's so much news taking place in Britain at the moment that it has rather swamped everything else. I wasn't even aware of this development. I'm sorry, which makes it hard to answer that question. What's your answer to it?
Well, I guess it involves a longer discussion, and it's best to yield my time to the other people who have questions. Maybe we can discuss it further.
Okay, we can discuss later. You can tell me about the European minimum wage and and then we can discuss how it affects migration. Yeah.
Thank you for your patience, Nebojša Milicic.
Thank you for a great presentation. I enjoyed, and
thank you for waiting.
Sorry.
I somehow think that I recognize something that I'm most concerned with in the entire conference, and that is the discourse of let's say immanent critique of global capitalist system. And I posted in a chat 3 references that are somehow also new to me. And this is historically the plundering of India through tax policy of British Empire, which money went directly in investment in United States, out of which relying on slavery work. Slavery work was
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we hear you quite badly. I think the internet connection is not very well.
Okay. I think only about normalization of historical development of capitalism through immanent critique. We present slavery or migration atrocities as something abnormal to capitalism. I think that it is high time to recognize that it is normal to capitalism. That is the point. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Should I press a button here? Okay. Thanks very much, Nebojša. Yeah, I agree with you. To a large extent, I think, and a lot of the recent upsurge in studies of capitalism's history, I think Sven Beckert, for example, have and the 1619 project have refocused attention to the role of slavery as being absolutely crucial to the formation of capitalism in its early days. I'm not quite sure I would go as far as to say that slavery is normal to capitalism, because I think there's something in capitalism that tends towards the reproduction of wage labor as the dominant form of exploitation rather than slavery. That seems historically to be the more defensible position, even though capitalism and slavery are completely compatible, and capitalism in its early period did rely very heavily on slavery. I do agree with you there.
Thank you so much. Vladimir?
Thanks. Thanks, Gerrit, for
this real tour de force that you gave us, 200 years of nexus between capitalism and migration. I'm working in a project that looks at the impact of migration on the migrants' political outlook, attitudes, behavior, and how they might influence the politics in their countries of origin. And as part of this project, we built a very, very comprehensive data set that looks at how they vote, how migrants vote in elections in their home countries, those who have the right to vote from abroad. And in sharp contrast to the literature that is very much informed by the neoliberal optimism about migration and the democratizing and modernizing impact of migration, the data set shows that they tend to vote for reactionary, authoritarian, populist right-wing parties in the countries of origin. For example, a Turkish diaspora in Germany that votes for AKP, being a paradigmatic example. I guess tomorrow we will see the Italian diaspora following a similar pattern. So my question for you is, I think one of the big failures of the left in Western Europe in the last few decades has been to engage and enlist and mobilize the labor migrants in their countries. And how can the left address this question? How can the left support migrants becoming political subjects in a progressive direction as part of an emancipatory project, particularly in this current context of far-right and authoritarian trends? Basically, how can the left help itself by helping the migrants and vice versa, if that makes sense?
Right. Thanks, Vladimir. Well, I'm very envious of you working on a project such as this that provides you with up-to-date data on this really important subject. I mean, a weakness in my own profile is that I spend so little time doing actual empirical work, and so you end up doing these 200-year tours of history and so on. So your data set sounds fascinating and important, and I'm a little surprised. I would want to maybe if you're coming to the bar later, we can discuss it in more detail. I'm a little surprised and saddened to hear the conclusion that you've drawn, but I would want to find out which countries you were looking at, and you say you find Turkish people in Germany tend to vote AKP. Well, Turkish people in Turkey tend to vote AKP, so you would have to look at the whether the AKP vote is stronger among migrants to Germany than among people in Turkey, and I would be interested in hearing what that difference is. You say a project of the left has to be to mobilize post-migrant groups, and I wholly agree with you. I mean, the left should be gravitating towards oppressed groups of all kinds and acting in their interests, and the centre-left parties tend not to do that because I mean, a case in point was the Labour Party in Britain that, I don't know, 10 years ago or so started producing mugs saying with the word immigration control on, and no kidding, this was the Labour Party. Buy a Labour Party mug and declare your opposition to immigration and your fervent libidinal desire for border control as you drink your cup of tea, of your English cuppa each morning for breakfast. So that's what one should not do if you're going to appeal to migrants. I mean, to be honest with you, in Britain and in the United States, post-immigrant communities tend to vote left. Certainly in Britain, Labour Party, in America, Democrats. But of course, there are particular constituencies. In America, for example, some very Catholic Hispanics will vote Republican on abortion restriction grounds, for example. You can have that sort of phenomenon. And in Britain, interestingly, you've seen a shift. Well, you've seen a shift in much of the West of Jewish migrants from left-wing politics to right-wing politics around the question of Israel. And you are currently seeing a shift of Indian communities around Islamophobia towards the right. So there are some particular migrant formations that are affected by certain forms of exile politics, as in the India case, which can lead them in a right-wing direction. But generally, I would hope and expect that post-migrant communities tend to vote left. I mean, that's my assumption. But maybe if I'm wrong, I want to hear. Actually, if I'm wrong, it would be, I would really want to hear some more detail and look at the statistics in some detail. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Garrett, so much. And I think if we all can agree, then I think we should stop here and continue over a more informal setting. Thank you all for participating. Thank you, Garrett, for this lecture and for the discussions. And I think this is the end of our 3-day conference. Florin, maybe you want to say something at the end?
Nothing except thank you very much to all the participants, everybody involved. We hope we're gonna continue this, and maybe we'll start working immediately for a collective volume following this conference. So I hope this was just the first step in a longer journey together. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for joining our conference here. Thanks a lot, and that's it. All the best.